Now, the federal government has just removed more than about 300 children from a remote border patrol station near El Paso. Now, this information comes from a Texas Congresswoman named Veronica Escobar. Now, this has been reported in Agence France Presse, or AFP, and the reason that they were removed was because of deplorable conditions, which included inadequate access to food, water, and, of course, sanitation. Now, that does not sound very safe and sanitary, which is what you're required to do thanks to the Flores settlement. Now, this apparently happened at the Clint border station in El Paso, Texas, according to the Customs and Border Patrol. They now have just 30 children who are remaining at that station. Now, the reason, of course, that the government had removed most of these kids was, I mentioned, terrible, deplorable conditions inside the camp. Now, attorneys that visited Clint last week said the older children were actually there trying to take care of infants and toddlers. They described a 4-year-old with matted hair who had gone without a shower for days, hungry, inconsolable children struggling to soothe one another. Some children were reported to have been locked for 3 weeks inside that facility, where 15 children were sick with the flu and another 10 were in medical quarantine. So now, look, I mean, the situation, of course, is just disastrous. It's sickening. You guys have, by now you've heard of the freezer and the dog pound. Those are situations where you have disease. Disease runs rampant in those conditions. And of course, later on, as that disease, festers and continues to spread among the migrant population, as it seems to already have in some circumstances, they come back and say, and they, meaning the Trump administration, oh, look at that. See, well, they're dirty and diseased. We can't let them in. But wait a minute. You put them in these conditions. No, I'm not saying they come through without, having the flu or whatever, or any kind of sickness. I mean, they just crossed the desert. But generally, if you put healthy people in those conditions, they often become sick. So, and that, of course, is horrifying when you think about it. Now, Escobar, and she's a local congresswoman from Texas. She basically asked to be informed by the end of the week with what steps Border Patrol would be taking to end these, quote, humanitarian abuses. Well, that would involve people actually caring about that. That would involve President Trump doing something about it. And why do I say that? It's because the fish rots from the head down. He's the person who implemented a lot of these draconian policies, and he can actually do something about it. And he says, oh, no, what am I supposed to do? I got to get Congress involved. I got to do all this stuff. No, you put those policies into place. Not President Obama. I mean, yes, President Obama does not completely get off the hook when it comes to this, because, he handled migrant children, the unaccompanied children, and sometimes those conditions were also terrible, right? But it's gotten even worse under Trump. I mean, since then, the government has cracked down on all undocumented immigrants, and so the problem with that, of course, is that, look, originally how it's supposed to work is these migrants, these unaccompanied children, would come in, and they would be held temporarily at some of these detention facilities, which, by the way, didn't always have the best conditions there, even under the Obama administration. And that was a huge oversight, and that was something that they should rightfully get castigated for, right, and criticized for. But what would happen is they would basically be handed over to sponsors to take care of these children after being housed in these temporary detention centers. Now, these sponsors would take care of these children until they were able to hear the asylum case and adjudicate whether or not they could stay in the United States. Now, because of this crackdown that we have on undocumented immigrants from the Trump administration, a lot of these sponsors refuse to come forward, who would normally take in these children to house them temporarily, and they no longer will. Now, why is that? Well, it's because a lot of them are also likely undocumented. So, and when ICE finds out that you're undocumented, they arrest you too, And then they set deportation hearings. And so that creates a situation where, well, you don't have sponsors to take care of these children. So they end up being housed in these temporary areas, which of course are unsanitary, not set up for long-term occupancy by these migrants. And then, of course, add in the added cruelty of the Trump administration, arguing that they don't have, any expectation to receive toothbrushes, beds, or soap. And you get these terrible conditions. And it becomes a gigantic humanitarian crisis, which, of course, at the end of the day, was completely manufactured. It's man-made. And again, these kids stuck in these conditions, the Trump administration says, well, they should be stuck in these conditions. They don't deserve beds and toothbrushes. Why? Because the cruelty is the point. And that is the point. They want to punish these children as a deterrent, these migrants. Look, the reason that a lot of these migrants come to America, and you hear from the right wing all the time, well, why would their parents just voluntarily send their kids up here? I mean, that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. Yeah, to avoid death squads. Again, there was a recent coup in Honduras. And by the way, if you want to blame the coup in Honduras on somebody, why don't you blame Hillary Clinton? She had a lot to do with it. She was in favor of that. That coup in Honduras, of course, ended up causing a lot of strife, a lot of poverty. There's now, a lot of corruption, drug gangs, and of course, this is exacerbated by our foreign policy, our drug war, specifically in the area, as well as our intervention in some of these Central American countries. So, kind of our fault, and yet we don't care as a country, basically. At least the administration doesn't care. And so, I mean, what we're doing is basically inhumane at the border. Let me, okay, again, we all know the conditions, right? You've got the dog pound, you've got the freezer, you've got these places that argue against, and these people that argue against basic sanitation. And then what's the result? 7 children that we know of have already died in Border Patrol custody. 24 people have died due to these conditions. And so that's the result of what's going on here. And I think that, look, more are going to end up dying until we actually do something about this and stop housing them in these camps. And there's a reason, or there's a way that we can stop doing that. And that's by the Trump administration going back on their draconian policies. And unfortunately, I don't see that happening because, as I said before, the cruelty is the point. A lot of Republicans are like, no, I'm in favor of this. Keep doing it. You show those migrant kids. You show those kids, they're not Americans anyway. Why should we care about them? I mean, I think it was Brian Kilmeade when he was on Fox and Friends. He said, they're not our kids. He made that argument. And it just kind of shows you what the Republicans think about this. Now, Border Patrol officials had not responded to the AP's questions about the conditions at that Clint facility, but they had emailed a statement that said, quote, our short-term holding facilities were not designed to hold vulnerable populations. No kidding. And we urgently need additional humanitarian funding to manage this crisis. Once again, this is a man-made crisis. Donald Trump started doing this on purpose. Again, doesn't mean Obama's off the hook, right? His administration, as I mentioned before, dealt with unaccompanied children. They did not do a good job. But Trump administration continues to argue that they should be living in these squalid conditions. Now, that said, those 300 kids that were taken, where'd they go? Where are they? Now, Escobar said that they were sent to another facility on the north side of El Paso called Border Patrol Station 1. Now, Escobar said this is a temporary site that at least has roll-out mattresses, showers, medical facilities, and air conditioning. Well, now that sounds a little bit better, right? Not so much. For that, we go to Clara Long. Now, Clara Long was an attorney who interviewed children at Border Patrol Station 1. Now, she said that these conditions are not necessarily better. Quote, one boy I spoke with said his family didn't get mattresses or blankets for the first 2 nights, and he and his mom came down with a fever. Now, Long is, by the way, a senior researcher with the Human Rights Watch. Now, that boy told Long, quote, he said that there were no toothbrushes and it was very, very cold. Now, look, that kind of sounds like the conditions of the freezer, which is kept at a constant 55 degrees. No mattresses, no blankets, sometimes hard concrete floor or wooden floor. And so those are the conditions, right? So even the place where they have at least beds, the conditions are still horrible. Now, again, to anybody who has this conversation of, well, are they concentration camps or not? I think they're pretty close. I would call them concentration camps. Now, that doesn't mean that they're death camps, and those are two different things. And if you're trying to make that argument, you're going to sound really stupid, because that's not what we're talking about. There's a difference. Concentration camps are set up to concentrate large amounts of people in conditions where they're basically unsanitary conditions. They're trying to set them up or set them aside because of the other. They're, I guess, people that we don't want in the country, or at least according to right-wingers, we don't want in the country. I would actually rather have the migrant kids than a lot of these very not pro-life right-wingers in the country. But that's my personal opinion. Now, again, these camps were designed to hold people in bad conditions to send a message, and that's why even though Long and a group of lawyers had planned 3 weeks in advance to inspect these facilities, right? They told Border Patrol, we're going to come in about 3 weeks to see if these conditions are livable. Border Patrol knew about it. They still didn't do it. They didn't provide mattresses. They didn't provide other essentials. They didn't do anything. Why? It's because I think the cruelty is the point. Either they didn't ask for the money, or they didn't get approved for any money, any appropriations, or they just didn't care. Either way, it's a disaster at the border, and unfortunately, it's been made worse by President Trump. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.